No worries. We're covered. We could just play word games. What am I thinking? Do you guys have other book festival events that you're, I know, Brad, you're back here at 3 o'clock in this room? That sounds fun. I like that connective tissue,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So what's the basis on that, like imagery or?
No, not so much that. The notion is like different parts of a book are tied to one another in different ways. And it sort of stemmed from, I don't know if you guys know Kij Johnson. She's a Wisconsin writer.
Okay.
Fantasy, mostly short fiction as well. She's a great writer. But anyway, she taught at Gen Con a number of years, and she talked about Luke and Leia in Star Wars and how they were sort of separated in the second movie, and like how they played off one another, those two things, and like they connected to each other, and that made me think
Right.
about other.
Their journeys were separate, and yet they had this. Yeah.
There's a narrative that sort of wound between them a little bit.
Oh, that's really interesting.
So one echoed the other, and vice versa.
Hello. Thanks for coming out to Central Wisconsin Book Festival. We have a list of sponsors I'm going to read off before we get started here. 2023 Central Wisconsin Book Festival support was provided by the Marathon County Public Library, the Portage County Public Library, and the McMillan Memorial Library. The Community Arts Grant Program of the Community Foundation of North Central Wisconsin, with funds provided by the Wisconsin Arts Board, the Community Foundation, and the B.A. and Esther Greenheck Foundation. Support also is provided by the Merco Foundation, Warzala, Reuter Ware Law Firm, Marathon County Public Library Foundation, the Portage County Public Library Foundation, the CoVantage Cares Foundation, the Center for the Visual Arts, Wisconsin Fellowship of Poets, Whitewater Music Hall, Stewart Inn, Bound to Happen Books, Yonke Bookstore, and Timekeeper Distillery. Thank you all for coming out to our first event here at McMillan of the day, the fantasy fiction panel. Today we have Bradley Beaulieu. Fell in love with fantasy from the moment he began reading The Hobbit in 3rd grade. While Bradley earned a degree in computer science and engineering and worked in information technology field for years, he could never quite shake his desire to explore other worlds. He began writing his first fantasy novel in college. It was a book he later trunked, but it was a start. A thing that proved how much he enjoyed the creation of stories. It made him want to write more. He went on to write the Lays of Anuskaya series as well as the Song of Shattered Sand series. He has published work in the realms of Fantasy Magazine, Orson Scott Card's Intergalactic Medicine Show, Writers of the Future 20, and several anthologies. He has won the L. Ron Hubbard Writers of the Future Award and earned a Gemmell Morningstar Award nomination. Learn more about Bradley by visiting his website, quillings.com. And next we have Catherine Addison, or Sarah Monette. Short fiction has been selected by the year's Best Fantasy and Horror and the year's Best Science Fiction. Her novel, The Goblin Emperor, won a Locus Award. As Sarah Monette, she is the author of the Doctrine of Labyrinth series and co-author with Elizabeth Bear of the Iskarin series. She lives near Madison, Wisconsin. Find more about her at catherineaddison.com. And we have Amy Allworden. Lives for adventure, or at least mild action that doesn't require a lot of bending. She grew up playing Dungeons and Dragons, reading Forgotten Realm books, and attending Renaissance festivals and reenactment societies. Armed with these formative experiences and enriched by a BSc in wildlife biology, as well as a year spent teaching English in Japan, she combined it all into a high-powered pastiche that fuels her creativity. Immolation is the first book in her debut series, Raven vs. Crow. For more information on the author or her novels, go to amyallworden.com. And now I will hand it over to the panel. They'll tell you a little bit about themselves. They'll field questions and discuss. Feel free to grab a bag or a Central Wisconsin Book Festival sticker on your way out, and or meet the authors, buy some books, get a book signed at the tables out in the lobby. Please give a warm welcome for our fantasy fiction author panel.
Well, do you want to talk a little bit about how you got started?
Sure. So I wrote my first fantasy novel when I was 12. And it was terrible. It was terrible. It's okay that it was terrible because I was 12. But I knew that was what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to be an author. I knew I wanted to write fantasy because I had always wanted to write fantasy. Never been interested really in anything else. So I kept writing and kept writing and kept writing and kept writing, and eventually came up with a novel that didn't need to be trunked, which is where you put it aside in a trunk and you never look at it again, which eventually became the first book of the Doctrine of Labyrinth series, which is Melusine. Those 4 books were published in the aughts, and then there was a pause while my health fell apart, but came back together again. And I wrote The Goblin Emperor, which was published in 2014 under a new name for publishing reasons that are long and boring and make no sense. And then after that, I have been writing more about that universe with The Witness for the Dead and The Grief of Stones. The 3rd book in that trilogy, The Tomb of Dragons, is going to be turned in hopefully at the end of October, so hopefully will be published next year sometime. So yeah, I mean, my journey to it was really pretty simple. I started writing because I didn't know I couldn't, and then
No one told you not to?
no one told me not to.
No one said stop?
No one said stop. And just I kept doing it, and I kept doing it, and I kept doing it because I love it. And I suppose one of the things to ask about is why fantasy? Why do I think fantasy is so interesting and other kinds of fiction not? And I was thinking about that on the way up here. And why do I do this? And partly I think I love the stretch of the imagination, that you push just a little bit farther than you do for realistic fiction. You have wizards, or you have aliens, or you have vampires. You have something that's just not quite the same as our world, and that's the part I love. So that's me pretty much.
Well, we'll go down the line. I think a very familiar path for...
I'm sorry, I'm deaf in one ear and I can't hear out of the other.
Sure.
And maybe everybody else can. I just thought I'd share that with you.
Yeah, that's okay. Is this better? Can you hear better this way?
You're still swallowing your words. You write very well, I understand.
Is this any better?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I can hear it more off the back of the room now. So I think a real familiar path for a lot of writers is, or a well-trodden path, is games, either role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons, right? And getting into dungeon mastering, game mastering, So playing the characters in role-playing games is one thing, and that's I think a useful skill as a writer, or it helps a writer, I should say. It's not a skill per se. But also becoming a dungeon master or a game master yourself, where you're creating the worlds, creating a bunch of characters which the players will meet, creating hopefully a plot line that the players won't try to veer off from too much. helps to sort of develop these skills to world build a fantasy world, create characters that live in them, create some of the justifications for what's happening in the world, and why is there something that's gone awry that the players have to address. And so that was my entree. I mean, I went into computer science and engineering. I went to MSOE in Milwaukee, worked in that field for 20 plus years before I got seriously into writing. But along the way, I just kept coming back. I was playing, computer role-playing games, running games, and then playing in them as well. So that was kind of my entree. But I really fell in love as I started to write more and more short fiction, eventually novels. This whole notion of kind of creating everything on your own, deciding what happens, and creating a piece of art in the end, and then putting that out in the world. So that's kind of how I got started. How about you?
Thanks. I was like that stereotypical kid who would read while they walked in school, right? Like books were my life. They were my escape. I loved everything about them, specifically fantasy, like Sarah had said. Just the expansive world. You could be anything. You could go anywhere. So, growing up, books were my solace, and I never remember a time not creating stories, because for me, the creation of stories is always about answering a question in myself, right? It's always, let's explore a feeling I have, and I'm gonna make these characters kind of act this out, right? To kind of explore, well, why does this happen? Why do I feel this way? The book that I'm just working on now is a series about a middle-aged woman who's got kids and is trying to decide, could she still be a hero again, So it's kind of a reflection of life for me. It's a way to answer those things for myself. But I've always been, like I said, as far as I can remember, I've always been writing stories. I did a very similar 5th grade book with a friend of mine, so yeah. Nothing I would show others. Nope. But it was a great introduction to that world of writing and creating stories, and it stuck with me. Even when I was doing many other things, getting a Bachelor of Science for me, I was still writing stories in the background, always looking for a place to do that. I didn't start thinking of it professionally until about 13 years ago. I started getting odd jobs, freelance writing, ghost writing. I worked for a gentleman in London who was making role-playing games, and he needed content and backstories and that sort of thing. And then eventually, doing enough ghostwriting, I thought, well, I've been wanting to write my own stories. Why don't I just write one for myself instead? So it's kind of my long journey to writing my own stories.
Do we have anybody that's currently writing fantasy in the audience? Like anybody that's curious about, like they're interested in writing fantasy? Somewhat.
Nobody who wants to admit it.
Yeah, you all do. You all secretly do. I know it. I mean, we could come up with some questions, but I did want to ask Colin if he had any prepackaged questions. Otherwise, we can sort of riff off of.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We have. Okay. Maybe not.
I have questions for you guys, actually, if you don't mind. Can I ask a question? Am I
Yeah.
allowed?
Yeah. We'll open it up too.
I think I'm the only indie published author up here. Are you guys both traditionally published?
I am, yes.
You are? Okay.
Well, I'm hybrid.
You're hybrid?
I've done some.
I
indie
find it
stuff
really interesting. How did you, like your journey to traditional versus indie? Was it a choice you made that you went, I'm going to go down this path?
Well, okay, it's a good question. When I started...
So what is traditional versus indie?
Traditional versus indie. Indie publishing is self-publishing, where you do all of it yourself. Traditional publishing, I have a publisher who takes my manuscript and makes it look pretty and puts it in book form and sends it out into the world for me. And both ways have their ups and their downs. When I was starting, though, and I was starting to think I was starting to be really serious about I want to do this professionally in the late 90s, and there was no indie publishing. It didn't exist. The whole self-publishing thing had not happened yet. So for me, it was never really there was never really that moment of decision.
Right, it was not a choice. You didn't have the choice.
Yeah, no options. So I went with traditional, and that has worked out for me pretty well.
Do you think you would try to do something self-published, or do you have no interest?
I think about it every once in a while, but actually my writing has slowed down so much that I have enough trouble coming up with books for my contracts that I'm not I don't have the thousands of ideas beating at my head, saying, let me out, let me out. So I would certainly consider it if there was an option, if there was a project that came up that said, publishers don't want this, but I'll do it on my own.
Right, that makes sense. Something, because we all know, like traditional publishing, they have certain interests. And if you're writing outside those interests, then it would make sense maybe to explore self-publishing. That makes sense.
Yeah, and I kind of fell into hybrid. So hybrid is someone who does some traditional, some indie stuff. When you're trying to publish, you're typically shooting for the big five. Used to be like the big six publishers, like Penguin Random House, Simon & Schuster, those types of companies. And because they have the biggest reach, is the idea. So you have the theoretically best chance for a success with your book. But there are a whole bunch of sort of mid-sized and then smaller publishers as well. And so my first book came out with a mid-sized publisher that did really well with a particular book and a few others. Paolo Bacigalupi had The Wind-Up Girl that did really well for Nightshade Books. And so they used that money to expand and buy more books, and mine was one of them. And so it's a very, very tough field. The margins are really tight, and so mid-sized publishers have a very tough time competing with the big publishers. And so my publisher went under, and I ended up getting the rights back to the book, to the books I had with them. And so I self-published the final book of a trilogy, and then I had some other shorter works that went along with it. So I self-published that as like a kind of an add-on to like the major books coming out, and then I've continued that since then. I like putting out novels through my traditional publishers, and then novellas, just shorter works, as independent publications in between books to kind of keep my name out there, give something for fans to sort of consume, between these larger works and such. So that's kind of where I am. As time goes on, though, the big publishers they're consolidating. There's fewer of them. They may become the big four soon. Who knows? And they may be down to 3 in a few years' time after that. And so what they do then is focus on the high-profile authors, the ones who sell the most, and try to scoop them up from each other. And anybody who doesn't meet a certain threshold, they just, let them go as they will. And so they'll fall to maybe mid-sized or smaller publishers. So it's a really cutthroat world. And so, I may at some point, instead of doing traditional for novels, try to do it myself. I don't know. We'll see how it goes.
Oh, that's really interesting. I'm curious about that hybrid. I like that idea of doing both, so you're getting your name out there consistently,
Yeah.
right? And kind of on your schedule, which
Right.
is cool. That's very cool.
And you're
I'm self-published, yeah. Mostly because I'm a control freak. I have a vision of what I want, start to finish, and I want to have total control over that vision. So at some point, if somebody makes an offer, I can't refuse. I'm not going to say I wouldn't. But for right now, I really, especially because, like I said, the work that I'm producing right now is very personal. It's the work that I'm writing is more like me talking to myself, and that's personal. And I don't want to have someone else tell me what that vision looks like. So that's where I'm at with self-publishing. And so far I've been happy with it. It's like you said, you're doing everything yourself. So, once I'm done writing the book, I have to go, okay, now marketing, how do I do that? Or, you have to teach yourself all these things. And I'm just in that part of it now. So,
Yeah,
it's
so
tough.
it's when you come to writing, you think of the writing process itself, maybe the editing, and not so much the publishing part. So just so people can understand, what hats do you have to wear as an independent publisher?
Oh, absolutely. So, you write the first draft, the second, and all the way up to the 10th draft, right, as a regular writer, and then you go through all the different rounds of some internal editing. I do reach out and find my own editors online who will go through line edits, proofread edits, developmental edits. So I have to find those people to help me with the story.
And pay them.
I find beta readers, absolutely.
No, I said and pay them.
Oh, and pay them, yes,
Yeah.
that's very true. I
So
have
like
to
you're
pay them.
paying up front instead of the publisher paying for
Exactly.
you, for paying for that editor, you are paying up front.
Yep, I'm paying for all those things. I find a cover artist, work with someone to design that. And then, like you said, all the different sales avenues, getting it published. For myself, I go through Amazon just because they have a pretty easy portal to work through. But there's Ingram, there's Nook and Barnes & Noble. There's all sorts of different areas you have to look into. How am I going to format my material to best suit these different avenues? So I do all the formatting myself. I reach out to bookstores if you can, that kind of thing. Yeah, many different
Yeah.
layers.
I know we're getting into business a little bit, but this is a fantasy panel, so why don't we tell the audience how you differentiate fantasy from other genres?
Okay.
What is fantasy?
Oh,
Sarah?
boy.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah, okay.
I like that.
Not a soft pitch. Okay, so in one of my other lives, I have a PhD in English literature, and I'm a genre theorist. So I really have opinions about how these things fit together. And I think of it as fantasy being the umbrella term for any kind of work where there's something that's contrary to what we know as the real world. So it could be magic, it could be science fiction that has technology we don't have yet. It could be horror where you are generally in something that looks like our world, but vampires are real or zombies are real or whatever terrible monster you want to think of is real. But I think of all of them really as fantasy because they're all doing the same thing. They're all saying, okay, but what if this was true? What would you do then? And there are lots of different kinds of fantasy. I mean, even aside from my sort of high-handed assumption that fantasy comes first and the others, and science fiction and horror are just subgenres. But there's lots of different kinds of fantasy. There's lots of ways to go about it. There's fantasy that happens in the real world but has something that's not the same, like horror, but without. But if elves, there are elves in Central Park, that kind of thing. There's fantasy that takes place entirely in a secondary world, a made-up world. And The Lord of the Rings is a great example of that. The Wheel of Time is a great example of that, where it's just made from scratch. Everything is new and different. And then there's actually a kind of fantasy that they call portal fantasy, which is where a person from our world goes to one of these secondary worlds. The Wizard of Oz is maybe the classic example of that, or The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where they go through the wardrobe right to Narnia.
Harry Potter.
Harry Potter.
He goes on a train.
Yes,
Through
he does.
a literal portal to get to the
Yes.
platform 9 3/4.
Yep. Or Diagon Alley. And any of these three, you can have any mix of them you like. I read one
many years ago, and I've now forgotten who wrote it, where the hero first had to go to into Fairy to do heroic things, and then came back, but Fairy followed her. So, you can mix and match. Fantasy is a wonderfully flexible genre that really almost anything you want to do, you can find a way to do it, which is one of the things that I love about it, is that it is so flexible that it can encompass so many people's crazy worlds. But that's what I think fantasy is.
And so I think it's fair to say there's a bunch of like smaller umbrellas under this bigger
Yes.
umbrella of fantasy. What do you consider like your wheelhouses? Where are you most at home in terms of those different umbrellas, personally?
Personally.
Yeah. In your writing.
Okay, so there's actually a little bit of a divide, which is not intentional, between I publish under my real name, which is Sarah Monette, and I publish under my pen name, which is Catherine Addison. And under both names, I have published secondary world fantasy, where it's all made up and you do all the work, the history and the geography and the archaeology. I love archaeology. I love putting archaeology in my books. But I also write horror. I write long form, in novels I write fantasy, and short stories I write horror. So I do both. My horror is mostly ghost stories. My dissertation is on ghosts also, so there's a theme. It's always important to look for themes. But I don't really write science fiction very much. The only science fiction I've written really has been co-written with a friend, because I like science. I think science is really cool, but I mostly don't grapple with it the way that I grapple with magic and the way I grapple with ghosts. So I love it, I admire it, I read it, I mostly don't write it.
So Sarah said something interesting earlier when she was describing fantasy, in that like if you change something, if some element of fantasy shows up in the world, what would you do? Meaning like what would an individual do if something changed in their life, say? And that's absolutely one way to look at it. The way that I like to look at things, and it's just a different take on the same subject really, is like, how does the world change? I'm huge into world building. I love that part of story creation. If there is a different source of magic, or a source of magic, let's say, like how do people use it? Who fights for it? It would become perhaps a resource like steel or oil or energy that causes problems in like politics and geopolitics. And how would religion change based on the existence of magic, perhaps only in one area, not in others? There's so many ways you can look at that stuff and sort of slice and dice a given type of magic, a source of magic, and so I like playing with that, figuring out what would change in an area in the world based on the existence of that thing. And so I often create that as sort of a bedrock, a garden, in which I'm trying to write the story, and then other things grow from that. So like the countries, the people, and then individual characters. What is the story that develops from that? What is about? I like writing about worlds that are about to change because of this, and I'm hugely driven by the climate change in our own world and what that means to us. And how can that sort of be reimagined in like fantastical terms? What is changing in a world based on the magic? Are people ignoring it? Are they trying to help it along? And so a lot of things stem from that. So that's what a lot of my fantasy is sort of based on. In science fiction, so I write secondary world as well. For whatever reason, I don't enjoy writing. I like reading it, but not writing about fantasy in our world. But I read science fiction, and that tends to be more in our world, oddly enough. So I do a bit of sci-fi, but mostly I'm known as a fantasist. So, how about you?
Yeah, I would say I'm much more like, Sarah as far as, and you as far as that world building, big fantasy, secondary world kind of stories. That's what I read growing up. That's what I really steeped myself into when I was reading, and that's where I feel most at home. I do write some science fiction. I have a problem with technical language. I love the ideas of it. I just can't wrap my head scientifically around some of the science enough to make it believable. Like a really great science fiction story, the science just overlaps so seamlessly, and I really appreciate how authors can do that. I'm not there yet. So someday I'd like to, get back into doing some science fiction, but mostly it's that secondary world. I love the idea of taking, like you said, the problems. Mostly I kind of explore like social issues. And then once you take a common social issue in our world and then put it on the face of, orcs and elves and all the, you're exploring a similar issue, but it looks completely different. And that's probably where I spend most of my time. Those are the stories that I enjoy writing the most. But I do like to kind of dabble within that secondary world in sort of subgenres, right? So action, adventure, epic fantasy, romance, even like, if you can imagine a Western based in a fantasy world. Like I like pulling from all those different themes to kind of get the story.
Okay, good. So I have a follow-up question, but I'm curious if you have any questions out there. I see a hand up here. Do you have a question? Well, I'll start by just sharing Sanderson's laws about this, and he has several laws around like that help in teaching. He teaches in Utah creative writing, and so like there is a continuum of magic for writers in which one side is very undefined, and the common example would be like Lord of the Rings. Gandalf just like does stuff. The ring does things. Sauron has powers because he has powers. And they can do whatever they want, kind of. It's implied that they have limitations, they know how to do it, but it's never explained in any kind of detail. And then the other end of things is more like Sanderson's works, plenty of others, where the magic is quite defined. Like, you must have this bit of this component along with this component. And when you combine those two things, they create this effect. And it is very science-like. And so what you end up with is, on the one hand, magic that is undefined and feels more mythic, which is a thing, and it's not good or bad, it just is. And then the other end, I think readers can feel more engaged on the other end because they know how it works, it's explained to them. And the characters can, I think, get more creative with how to utilize the magic and how they employ it in interesting ways. Maybe finding a wrinkle that other people haven't thought about, and a new invention in magic. But it does feel less mythic on that end, and so it does feel more science-y. And so like maybe more accessible, but not as fun in some ways. And so you, as a writer, you have a choice to make. Where do you fall in that spectrum? And I tend to fall, well, somewhere in between, I guess. I don't want it to feel like completely arbitrary, because that feels like Harry Potter. They can do whatever they want as long as they know a Latin phrase and they wave their wand a certain way, right? And it just starts to feel silly after a while, and it's a YA/middle grade type series, and I'm fine with that. I love that series, but for me writing, I want I want it to be more defined. I want there to be costs. But I don't want it to be so loosey-goosey that it just feels totally arbitrary. So I try to, and because I mentioned the world building aspect, I try to make the magic sort of an organic part of the world. And so I do define like how that stuff works and then how people can sort of utilize that. And then on top of it, I tend to have at least 2 different types of magic in my worlds as well. So there's like different wrinkles. Maybe they stem from the same basic power source, but I like having sort of different schools of thought of magic and how people might use them. So that's my take.
So I have 2 different answers again. The Doctrine of Labyrinths, which I wrote mostly when I was in grad school, looks at there are schools of magic, like there are schools of critical theory. And each school has its own very strong opinions about how you do it, but they're all correct. They're all correct in different ways. The only incorrect theory of magic is the one that doesn't work. So that was a lot of fun, actually, coming up with these different metaphors for what magic is and what magic does, and how do they work, and how do they work against each other, and how do they work together, and what happens if you are a wizard from one school and you visit another school, and what nonsense do you find that they're teaching their students? What can you learn from them? So that's one answer. The other answer is the Goblin Emperor books, where none of the characters are wizards, and so they don't know how magic works. And magic in that world is a very, very low-key, very laid-back, restrained kind of thing, where it doesn't happen very often. So they don't really have a lot of exposure to it, which means that I don't have to come up with 3,000 different schools of magic, and how they work together and how they don't. Eventually, I suppose I will write a book in that world that has a wizard as a main character, and I'll have to figure it out, but I haven't got there yet.
I would say I land on that Brandon Sanderson side of science. So I'm a hardcore biology nerd, and I love the idea that there's something that maybe we can't explain, but it has this effect that we would call magic. But when you boil it down, it's sort of this scientific element that is capable of doing these amazing things. So in the world that I'm building now, and I feel more comfortable in that area where, I can sit and really think about what is this element. It's very organic. What could it possibly do to a person? Can they, ingest this? Is it just they touch it and something happens? And I trace that biological reaction to sort of a logical step, and then I push it a little bit further, so it's fantastical, right? And then using sort of real world examples, because we have things in our world that if you ingest it, it's going to give you a really interesting reaction, right? So I take that and then I just kind of explode it into a fantastical element. So very organic, very tied to the world of the book. Yeah, good question, thank you.
Any other questions? You have one here, and then I'll come here.
You had mentioned earlier, a couple of you, sort of social aspects of driving writing. I find that to be interesting when you have a Stephen Bruce where you get this empire and you have this revolution going on. You have revolutions in this part of your history. So what sort of, along with magic, what sort of social or political kinds of things do you find interesting to drive your story?
I can start.
Go.
All right, so
Start.
I do like focusing on the geopolitics. I mean, I'm a J.R.R. Tolkien disciple, so I love having this sort of mythic feel to things, and I often sort of regurgitate some of the same kinds of ideas, like these ancient things are reawakening in some way, and then in one case in the The Layers of Honest Sky in my first series. Uh, okay. There's a like a blight that's sweeping through the land, and the world is about to go under change, under a change, and it's sort of magically based, and people have been ignoring it for too long, and so the people have sort of enriched themselves off of that, sort of not devouring the land, but sort of feeding on this magic for too long, and it's not an inexhaustible resource, and so there has to be a point at which they come to grips with this and decide that they have to change. They have to change their way of life. But the people in power, of course, got there for a reason. You know, they've inherited this power and don't want to change. And so there's lots of struggle, you know, with doing that, sort of waking people up to the reality, first of all, and then making them do something about it once they actually do realize that is the cause. And so very much sort of climate, you know, change based. And so, yeah, so I do try to imagine what that will mean for the main powers in play in the worlds that I create, you know, because, you know, like it or not, there's often like sort of centers of power that are controlling things. And so I like to think about how, you know, what those things are, first of all, and then how individuals can make a difference in those, either keeping the status quo as is or making a change, being a catalyst, you know, for change. That's interesting to me. And so those tend to be my main characters, you know, maybe kings, queens types of people, but also, you know, maybe people not so well off who have some ability to make a change, either through personal relationships or through the magic that they control, influencing people, what have you. You know, so those are the wrinkles I try to explore, like what are the power bases given the magic of the world, who controls them, what's about to change, and who can help make those changes, you know, and who's trying to keep it the same. I don't know, so that's kind of how I think about it.
Okay. I think I was, thank you, Brad, for talking, because I was thinking.
I know, we all need a little time sometimes.
Notice I go last.
So I was thinking about this, and it varies for me from book to book. In the Doctrine of Labyrinths, the main character, one of the main characters is a very powerful wizard, and this causes him all kinds of problems, because actually being a very powerful wizard is not all that much fun. But the book is very personal. Those books are very personal to their main characters, that they're what they are going through. The Goblin Emperor, on the other hand, as the title suggests, the main character is the emperor. And that book is really interested in politics and what you can and cannot do if you are emperor, and what changes you can make and what changes you can't make, and how you can work around people who are blocking figures, who are, you know, other sources of power. How do you work? It's a little Machiavellian. And then the books I'm working on now are basically interested in the question of what happens in a society if you have people who can speak to the dead. I think they're just sort of unrolling that question out farther and farther and farther, because it does have really sweeping changes. But I am not so much with the geopolitical. I tend to write very character-focused stories that sometimes have a lot of politics in them.
Thank you for giving me more time. I would say that the series that I'm writing now, probably the biggest moving social force that I'm working with, and I find really interesting to explore, is the concept of religion. Where do religions come from? How do different people see those religions? And when one sort of section of the population sees your religion as an evil thing, and they try to stop that, who's right and wrong? Maybe you're both right, maybe you're both wrong. What is someone willing to do based on their own fear of something that they can't see or touch? And just the ripples that can kind of come from that, and how everyone sees it differently, and that sort of thing. So that's probably the biggest thing in mine. Thank you.
Do you have a question?
A couple of you mentioned that you trumped your earliest novels. I'm wondering why you, now that you've got more experience, both in life and in writing, why you would go back and revisit that book and try to fix it.
The book I wrote, the book I wrote when I was 12, it's a 12-year-old book. It doesn't have, it's also very heavily based off of having read David Eddings one too many times. So it's a child working on a narrative. It's not really anything that you could work with. The book I wrote in high school has so many problems, and they're so wound into the structure of the book. I have looked at it. I have gone back and I have looked at it, and I said, well, okay, could I fix this? And discovered that no, it's just the problems that I didn't know how to fix when I was 18 are problems that I know how to fix now that I'm 48, but not without completely disassembling the book around them. So if I'm going to do that, I might as well just write a new book.
I think it's going to be a similar story, and it is for me. Like the problems I think are of two types, and they both usually apply. One is that when you early in your career, or even later, there's sometimes books that just don't work. They didn't work for a reason, and when you're an early writer, it's often because not only is your writing immature, but the ideas that and the characters and even the world is immature in some way, and that could be because it's derivative or too simplistic, or the idea is just broken. It doesn't survive scrutiny, as you look at it like more closely. So that's a problem, and then I think the other problem is, at least for me, like when you write a story. Early on, it's pretty malleable. Like you're sort of working out who the characters are, what the world is like, and then what happens to them along the way, and you can sort of change course fairly easily as you're writing it, as you're developing it, even in the early stages of editing it. But over time, after say the second or third draft, it starts to solidify. It's like epoxy. You've mixed these things together and they harden, and it's really, really hard to rework it. It just breaks. It shatters, and you just have to start over. And maybe the last thing is you fall out of love with the idea. You see all these problems, and you're like, that doesn't give me juice to write it anymore. And that's half the problem with being a writer, is having the drive to stay in the chair and get a book out every so often, whatever you want, one a year, a couple a year, whatever, what have you. If you don't like what you're writing, it's really hard to write that thing, and it shows up in the end product too. Like if you don't enjoy it, the readers probably won't either.
Yep.
So that's a number of the reasons for me. Mm-hmm. Have you had trunk books as well?
I've got pieces of stories that I don't come back to, and for the most part, kind of echoing some of what you said. When I was a beginning writer, I was interested more in the what of the story. We're in a cool world doing cool stuff. And now I'm interested in the why of the story. Why are we doing this thing? What inside of me needs to be answered or said? So that's changed. And though I could go back to those cool elements, and I sometimes do pull from old things, they kind of get a renewed life in new work, I don't ever go back to it in its entirety anymore. Thanks.
Any other questions? One here?
You've all done a fair amount of writing, so we were scared to assume you often across writer's block. How do you handle that?
Ooh, that's a really good question. First of all, I think we have to sort of say, okay, what is writer's block? And writer's block is where you find that you want to write and you can't write. You want to write and you can't write. There are other kinds of problems that writers can have about not wanting to write. I'd rather go do this other cool thing. And what Brad was just saying, you have to have something that is keeping you coming back to this chair and this story. And if you don't have it, you need to try again. But you want to write and you can't write. And there can be a lot of different reasons for that. One of them is that you've gotten to a point in the story and you don't know what happens next. And that part I figure out by free writing, loosely so called, because I don't do it the way that other people do it. I say, okay, why am I stuck? And then I write about why I'm stuck. And eventually that turns into, okay, how can I get unstuck? It doesn't always work very quickly, which can be really, really frustrating. And again, you have to have something that's pushing you to go back, to keep beating your head against this brick wall until the wall falls down, is what it feels like some days. So that's the simplest sort of answer. There are other reasons for not being able to write, like you literally don't have time because you have a job, you have family, you have other commitments that you have made that you have to honor. You can not be able to write because you're exhausted. It's important to rest, because burnout does happen. Writers do get to a point, professional writers can get to a point where they can't do it anymore because it's turned into all job and no love. And then you stop and you go back and you think about the things that you love and you read the books that you love and you sort of are patient with yourself. Patience is an important part, I think, of any kind of getting around any kind of writer's block, is being patient with yourself, being patient with your brain, being patient with your story. And thus far, knock on wood, it eventually works. And eventually it come back around and say, oh, okay, I know how to do this again.
Thoughts on writer's block?
I would say, yeah, something similar to you as far as if, you're experiencing writer's block. To me, it's been very helpful to really analyze the why of why you're blocked. That's probably the best advice that I've heard and that I would give others. If you're reading what you've written and it's boring you, then that's probably a sign you need to re-look at that scene a little bit and be like, well, maybe it's just not a great scene. If and this happens to me a lot personally, is that I'll sit down to write and then, oh, I got to get the laundry done, or, oh, wait, hold on, I got to go do some dishes quick. And I know I'd rather be writing, but it's because the scene I'm writing is hard, emotionally difficult to write. So that's a tough one. You kind of have to take it in bites, right? Take it in little pieces and that kind of stuff. So if you can have that separation from yourself and the work to realize what's going on with me, what's going on with my story, that helps a lot to kind of pull the threads and find out why you're disconnecting from your story a little bit.
If you haven't been able to tell so far, I'm a very nuts and bolts kind of guy when it comes to like developing the world, developing the story, but also in terms of like writing advice. I give a number of talks on writing and stuff. And so one of the things that I say about writer's block is that sometimes it's because you took a wrong turn somewhere. And so there are many reasons for writer's block. But try to go backwards through your story and go as far back as you need to find the place where it feels good. I was totally on track at this point. right around there, probably the next scene or the end of that scene, is a place where you made a decision for the characters that was wrong in some way. They did something that they probably should not have done. It doesn't work thematically. It doesn't fit the characters. It doesn't get them closer to the end or even further away from the end. So take a look at that. I am also a rules-driven writer. I have these goals for the day and stuff, and goals I have weekly goals, I have monthly goals, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes that pressure is a lot. And I don't mind it normally, but at times I'm like, this is too much, man. I need to get away from this stuff for a day or two. And so I do. And sometimes that freedom just frees up the logjam while you're gone. And then just one last thing I'll pass along is that sometimes you're feeling a bit lost because you've lost. I talked about juice before. Like you've fallen out of love with the story for whatever reason. Maybe because life is intruding. Maybe because the pressure is high to finish it. Whatever. And so there's different ways to do this, but I keep Pinterest boards for my stories to generate architecture, garb, food, geography, all kinds of stuff. And I developed that stuff early on. And so when I was developing it, I was so excited about this book and this story and these characters and stuff. And so as I'm writing, I'll get to this point where I'm like, I'm getting tired of it, I want it to be done. And so I'll often go back and literally just scroll through my Pinterest board. And it works so well to snap my mind back into that place where I was excited about the story. It was like, you see these memes that talk about the thing is I envisioned it, and it's this beautiful painting of a horse or a picture of a horse, or whatever. And then what I actually came up with is this crayon drawing of a horse, And that's what it feels like as you're writing. You're like, this is horrible. I can't stand this thing, And so anyway, so getting back to that picture of the horse for a little while, for a day or two, just be in that place for a bit. And sometimes that helps you get back on track. Any other questions? One more? Let me go way in the back. Well, wait, you haven't asked one yet here. Yeah.
It strikes me it's convenient to be a practicing schizophrenic.
Yeah, well, I mean, you certainly have to wear a lot of hats, right?
Yep.
To inhabit, the characters and stuff. And then, I mean, that's not even counting.
Yeah, I'm probably not the only one at the table that talks to themselves.
Yeah.
So
Sure.
yes, I think you're right.
Yeah, they talk to you.
Constant inner dialogue.
Yeah. Did you have one back there? Again?
Yeah, I did. It's kind of a two-sided question. We have these large language models, ChatGPT, these generative AIs,
Mm.
which have, very clearly already been used to spam books into Amazon and things like that. But there are also authors that I've read about that are using them to sort of generate the sort of local color of their story to save them writing effort so that they can focus on their character-driven stuff or their geopolitics or whatever might be happening. And I'm just curious about your thoughts on these things, which have been, trained on the body of humanity's
Mm-hmm.
exposition that
I
on
read
the
it.
internet that they've just sucked up and fed into these algorithms. So the two sides are how do you feel about that? And has that sparked any ideas for stories that you feel like you might want to tell? AI in stories obviously isn't new, but right now it's clearly very topical.
Any thoughts?
I personally don't think that you save effort by skipping parts of your world building. Even if it's not, even if you're trying to think of the history of a city and you don't need it all for what's going to be in the story. You need it all for your brain. I spent a long time drawing maps between the Goblin Emperor and the Witness for the Dead that I haven't used. I haven't looked at them again, but boy, did I need them. And I think that it looks like a good shortcut, but it's really not, is my feeling.
I haven't had any ideas based on it at this point, but like, there's so much wrapped up in it. Like, there's a thing going on around now. These last week or so, The Atlantic came out with an article about ChatGPT and which books actually fed it. And so there's a searchable database on that article, the Atlantic article, where you can look up which books are there, and you can look by your name. And so I've done it. Plenty of other people have done it. Almost all of my books, I think there's one or two missing, the shorter works, are already in there. And so like the thought of me like doing that, I know that I'm taking from somebody else. Like it didn't train itself. It doesn't have its own knowledge, ChatGPT, right? It's basing it on other people's writing styles and stuff. And I cannot even consider doing that, and stealing from others. I was thinking about what they might do for that. Like after these lawsuits that are absolutely coming go through, will they have to retrain ChatGPT on only publicly
Public domain.
stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so then will all the books that come out of them be written in like Charles Dickens style or something like that,
Yes.
which would be interesting. But yeah, I never thought about like the "it doesn't save you" type of thing, and I suspect that's true. Like if you had it write a whole book for you even with the characters that you define and stuff, you'd have to read the entire thing. And it would probably be some nonsense. I can't imagine it has good continuity and or originality involved. And so then you have this thing where you're trying to like take what's there and like heighten it in some way, make it more original, more interesting, more fun, what have you, more horrific. But then by the time you do that, like you're rewriting what's there anyway. And so, yeah, I suspect it would take you as long or longer. And just taking that, just the act of writing, probably everybody who does it gets satisfaction from completing that thing, from creating something from scratch. And so like taking what something has given you and then like embellishing it a little bit, I would get zero satisfaction from that. So I absolutely would not do it from that aspect as well.
Yeah, I find that really interesting question. So from a practicality point, I do know that right now, when you upload a book to Amazon, there is now a portion that says, was any part of this written through AI? So you have to declare it, and that includes the cover images as well.
Yeah.
So it's something that's being declared right now, and I assume they're doing it proactively in case they need to take things down later, right? So, the work that's out there, like I said, it's sort of a self-declared thing, so I don't know how honest everyone is on it, but I did when it I don't want to say first because it's been around for a long time, but when it was sort of first being known to me, I did go on to ChatGPT just to kind of play around and see what is this all about and how is it a tool that I could use to help myself. And I just took a scene that I was kind of struggling with. 2 guards need to fight someone escaping a prison, and I kind of put in that sort of thing. And it spit out a result that was effective, but not emotional. It lacked so much. It was like seeing, again, that crayon drawing, right? It was like seeing that crayon drawing rather than being there. So it lacked so many levels, I thought. It was effective. It did what I asked it to, but it really, like you said, I don't feel that it would be as helpful in the long run because I would be adding all the other layers to it that I would normally add as a writer. So it would slow down the process, in my opinion.
Yeah. You might as well just do it yourself.
Yeah.
I think we had another question. Oh.
Yeah.
Sure.
You kind of alluded to the fact that you know the ending of the story when you start. Do you? And are you ever surprised that the ending is different than what you thought?
For me, that varies from book to book. I had one book where I knew the ending before I knew the beginning, and that book was just all about getting to that ending. That's the only book of mine that worked that way. Most of the time, I don't know the ending when I start. Part of what I enjoy about the first draft is writing it's called a discovery draft, where you are discovering the plot and the characters and the world as you go. I vastly prefer that, because it gives you room for things to be different, and because it gives you room to say, well, okay, well, what if I didn't do that? What if I did this? Or, what if I've done this because I thought that's what the plot wanted, but now I see that I should have done that. But this is something that varies really widely from author to author. Some authors know the whole thing before they start. Some authors are like me. Some authors are somewhere in between.
In my opinion, Sarah is an alien, because only an alien could just write a book and get to some cool ending without knowing what it is beforehand. I cannot write. I thought maybe I could, and I actually didn't really, because I came from gaming and stuff. I sort of thinking about structure a lot and how things are going to go, and Stephen King's book on writing, which is a really good book if you're interested in writing, or it's like semi-biographical too, so it's interesting from that perspective. But he talks about these two things, an organic writer where you just kind of find it along the way, and like a sort of an architectural, designer of plots and stuff. And I fall pretty much into that second camp, although not everything is defined. I like having some structure. I do find things along the way. I do change course. But I also, I write forwards and backwards at the same time. It's because I have the ending in mind, I can plot backwards. I can figure out if I know more or less, again, it's not totally clear, but if I know more or less what happens at the end, I can tell what happens just before that, and maybe just before that. Maybe not specific scenes, not even maybe who's in them, but I know what events have to happen, and so that helps get me a little bit closer than the full ending, from wherever I am in the book. So it just helps. So I plot forward, as far as I can go, and I also plot backwards, and helps me connect those two things, and hopefully in the end, the journey is interesting. It's not some linear, predictable plotting kind of thing. You have to watch out for that as well. And I think that's one of the negatives that people will say, and I think it's true if you're not careful, that a sort of a plot that is sort of predetermined up front can feel predictable, perhaps, or not interesting enough. It doesn't carry the reader along the way because not enough twists and turns happen. So that's a potential danger. So I'm not surprised, but things don't change very much for me typically because I know too much up front.
Yeah, I think I'm right along with Brad there as far as I really start with a heavy vision in mind. I don't know every scene involved. I don't know when we're going to hit the tavern, but we'll be there eventually. That kind of thing. I know where we're headed, where we're going to end. A little bit of that middle just needs to be developed, but much more like how you described it for me. Yeah.
You are both aliens.
No, you're the alien. I don't know what time we're supposed to be wrapping up.
Another question?
But yeah, we can do maybe a couple more questions, and I have one wrap up one we can do maybe.
I guess my question revolves around there's this concept thing that have cultural appropriation, and in fantasy you're somewhere else, so you're not lifting songs from Menominee history or something, but there are echoes of our world even if you're in an alternate world. So like you have a desert series, and when you're writing, how much thought goes into how do I make this not seem like something that exists already? Or if you're in a Northern European-esque setting, how you write that so it doesn't seem like you're just ripping off the Norse editors or something.
Yeah, well, I mean, you touched on cultural appropriation, and it's a concern even in secondary fantasy. even in science fiction, I suppose, you know, there will be clear parallels if you are drawing on parallels from our world and such. So that's constantly on my mind. I don't want to, well, I don't want to steal a culture outright. I also don't want to do them a disservice, you know. So I pay attention to that along the way. But then, I mean, for me, it's I'm trying to make the world like my desert-based fantasy is based on our Middle East, and the main set of characters and people set in this city of Sharkai in this vast desert has roots in our Bedouin culture. These people revere traveling, visiting different places in the world, and sort of honoring those things as they move around. They revere sort of gathering together and talking about those different travels, sharing with one another, and so. Yeah, like inheriting some of that stuff but making it its own is a challenge, and it's something that's constantly on my mind. And I don't know how to talk about making that happen beyond making your characters feel real to you, making them feel like individuals, and doing the sort of the same with the cultures, so that yes, I mean, you're inheriting stuff from our world, but you are making it its own thing, and you're breathing life into that place, so it doesn't feel like the same thing. People can feel like they're visiting something new. It's a tough one. It's something that I try to be really mindful of. I'm sure all of us are.
Yeah, I mean, one way to do it, which is the way I did it in the Doctrine of Labyrinths, is to just patchwork. So the city has the French Revolutionary calendar, but also the city has the Byzantine calendar. I wrote this in grad school, you can tell. But it's little bits and pieces from all kinds of different places that I put together and said, well, okay, what if I put these together? What would that culture look like? It was actually a lot of fun to do. But you're right that it's an issue in secondary world fantasy, because it's really easy, if you're not paying attention to what you're doing, to lift something entire, to appropriate somebody's culture, or do the culture a terrible disservice by what you've done because you're not paying attention. That's sort of my it's not a good answer really, because it's very rudimentary, but really paying attention to what you're doing and thinking about what you're doing.
Being mindful about your choices.
Yes,
you know,
being mindful about your choices, and doing the best you can.
I think sometimes for me when I'm reading, there's the choice of when you're talking about cultural objects, you can either make up a thing and give it its own name, or you can say, well, there's this single-edged curved sword that this guy uses.
Yeah.
I'm going to call it a katana.
Right.
Because you know what a katana is, so then I don't have to spend 5 paragraphs
Yeah.
telling you exactly what the thing is, and you know it's a katana, but I call it a craft. So, I mean, yeah, it seems like there's a balance.
Just to amplify something you said quickly, I really do like. There is a danger in like sort of rubber stamping something from our world and just like putting it in your world. And one of the ways you can combat that is by combining different little pieces from our world, because it makes it feel unique. And our world is messy. There are influences here from all over the world, and that's true of any geographic area, right? It's not all one thing. There are influences from all around and from time, and different colonizers perhaps, or technologies that existed that are no longer there, or whatever. And so like just sort of pulling things somewhat randomly, as long as they feel like they fit, can help create this sense of ordered chaos that makes your world feel real, and lived in. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think for me, I approach it very similarly as far as that patchwork, always trying to keep things in mind, and trying to use the word inspired by versus
Sure.
taken from, right? I like your example of using the word katana, because then the reader goes, oh, I know exactly what that is. I watched a video of a gentleman who said, reading the Secondary World book and had to put it down because they drank champagne. He goes, can't you find another word for something that was derived from a fruit, And I guess it's really particular, right, to each reader how disruptive that earth word would be, because it has connotation and it has depth, and sometimes it has culture attached to it. So, yeah, I don't think there's a really good answer for that. It's a good question, though.
Yeah.
We're getting close to time. Maybe
Yeah.
should I? Do you have a quick one?
I don't know how quick it is.
All right, let's do one more, and then I'll ask to wrap up.
It actually kind of dovetails on Claire's question. I've been reading a lot of Neil Stephenson lately, and he writes these massive info dumps in his stories that are somehow like gripping
Yep.
and exciting and fun to read. And info dumps are obviously treacherous territory for a writer because they can do exactly like you were suggesting, spending whatever 5 paragraphs or 5 pages trying to explain something that you could maybe simplify with a single word. And I was just curious, like, how you approach info dumps when you know you've got to dump a bunch of information and try to make it part of the story rather than having it knock your readers out of the story.
I'll
Go
go.
ahead. We all have thoughts on this, I'm sure.
Yeah. The best thing I've ever found to do is to have characters who like to tell stories. Because you can generally, whatever information you need to convey, you can put it in a story. And if your characters like to tell stories, and that's something that's just part of who they are, it doesn't feel as dumpish. But other than that, I think there is a difference between an info dump and exposition, because exposition is necessary. You have to have paragraphs that aren't dialogue. Finding the edge between those two things, I think it depends a lot on. Tolkien does this. Tolkien writes beautiful, beautiful, beautiful travel narratives that look so easy. And then you try to do it, and it's like, no, this is hard. This is really hard. So it depends a little bit on the writer's own strengths as to what they can do this with. But I think everybody has something that they're so interested in that they can make it exciting. At least if you're a writer, you'd better be able to make something exciting.
I thought you were going to give me more time to think.
I can.
No, that's fine. For me, my writing style doesn't lean towards heavy world like that info dump. I don't tend to come across that a lot in my writing because I really focus on fast pace. We're into the action. I'm going to give you just the bones of what you need to know before you get going. Just my personal style, I don't spend too much time in that kind of space where that could be a problem. So for myself, I avoid it by just yeah, I don't have to tell you how tall the building is because we just jumped out the window, right? So that's kind of where I land on that.
Yeah, for me as a writer, my instinct from the get-go was like, when I come across some new bit of magic, information technology, or whatever, I have to orient the reader. I have to make them understand what this thing is about and stuff. And that instinct is horrible. It's the last thing you want. Because we forget as writers sometimes that the reading experience, as you're going through the stuff, part of the fun is to see some of that stuff without it being explained. And readers will put up with a lot. They're experienced readers typically, it's probably not the first science fiction or fantasy book they're reading. So when they come across something odd, they will trust that the author will explain that at some point, or that it will come organically as we live in the world more and more through the reading process. And so when you need to explain things, let me put it another way, you want to explain things by making the reader want the information. And there are certainly times for exposition. We have to do that at certain points. So when do you do it? When the reader wants to know. When do they want to know? When it's important to the plot. So you make some wrinkle in the story crucial to the plot, and perhaps one character doesn't get it. They're not in the know. And so they can talk about it instead of just explaining it in a dump. They can dialogue it through, and it's so much more interesting that way, because someone can bring up some points like, well, no, that won't work because X, Y, Z. But you haven't thought of, A, B, C. And so make the reader want to know about it, and then play it out if you can in dialogue. I really admire people like Stevenson who can do that kind of stuff. I think like Clancy and some like military sci-fi writers can do that kind of thing well also, because some readers sort of eat that kind of stuff up, like sort of the explanation of what a weapon or a ship, is like and stuff. I try not to do that stuff so much myself, because I feel like I'm not good at that sort of thing. I can't make exposition interesting in and of itself. I have to make it an organic part of the story.
It's a matter of what you can do with your voice.
Yeah.
And the voice of the story.
Right.
Because some stories have these very explanatory voices where that's how the story works. And some stories really, really don't. And again, this is not a good thing or a bad thing. This is a story thing. But yeah, if your voice doesn't want to stop and talk about it, then you really shouldn't. But if your voice does want to get into it a little bit, like if you have a Stevensonian voice, you should totally go with it.
All right, so we're close to time. So I thought of a question earlier, and it was to do with what do we write? What umbrellas do we inhabit, in our own writing? So the follow-up question, and tell people where they can find you after this as well. And I'll start just to get things rolling, give you guys a chance to think about it. Who is a writer that you admire that does something that you don't do very well, and you admire them for it? And so I'll start, so Brad Beaulieu, you can find me at quillings.com. All my socials are there. And a writer that I really admire is Neil Gaiman, because he writes a lot of encapsulated single novel stories. I tend to write series. I don't know, that's just where I come from. It's what I like. I spend so much time in the world. I don't want to stop after one book, after all that effort. And the stories tend to be a bit longer. But Gaiman has just a real knack for starting and ending a story that just feels complete and whole and beautiful and wonderful. One of my favorites is The Ocean at the End of the Lane, just a great, great novel. So that's me.
This is not an easy question.
Yeah.
Okay, first of all, Catherine Addison or Sarah Monette. CatherineAddison.com is where I'm on the web. I have a lot of writers. Actually, the thing I admire, because I'm struggling with it, is writers who can do mysteries really, really well. Dorothy Sayers. I admire Dorothy Sayers just beyond comprehension, because she writes. They're funny, they're thoughtful, the voice is amazing, and they're good mysteries. And
Is she fantasy?
no, she's a mystery writer. Okay. She was a mystery writer, I should say. The Witness for the Dead and The Grief of Stones and sort of The Tomb of Dragons, which is the third book, are mysteries. And boy, was that a stupid thing to do. Because it's really hard.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's where my admiration is. Actually, to go with a fantasy writer, Barbara Hambly, who writes fantasies and mysteries and historicals and historical mysteries and historical fantasies. And just all kinds of things, and is amazingly good at it. And partly it is because I write, I don't know where I'm going when I start writing,
I was gonna say.
which is the opposite of what you need with a mystery, because
Yeah.
you have to know who did it before anybody else does.
Right.
Found that out the hard way. But so yeah, people who can do that is just and do it so that it looks easy is something I admire very much.
Thank you. So again, Amy Allworden, and I'm at amyallworden.com. I was gonna say Neil Gaiman, but for a different reason.
Okay.
I love the language that he uses. When you read a book by Neil Gaiman, it's like a treat to hear the words, just his word choice, the sentence structure. You feel like you're just being lifted up and carried away, He just has this lyrical writing about him that I enjoy. And actually, I listen to audiobooks because even when he speaks, he has a very lyrical way about him.
Yeah. His performances are great.
It's fabulous. And that is something that I would like to grow into as a writer. Because again, I'm that fast-paced, get in action. I don't stop to be lyrical for the most part, right? I have imagery, but compared to Neil Gaiman, I don't have imagery. Like, he's just fantastic at it. So either Neil Gaiman or, again, Diane Wynne Jones. She does a very similar. She's very, very lyrical, and they have that almost fairy tale folklore aspect about how they write that I really admire.
All right. Well, I think we're at time. Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much.